Hey everybody, so welcome to this workshop. So today I'll be talking about, how do you, what makes a successful mobile application? And this will largely be through like a product management lens, not really the technical lens. And so we'll be going through a lot of different examples, a lot of examples of applications that are used on a pretty, regular basis, some of which are very popular. And we'll be looking at them from like a different, kind of a different lens from what we usually look at them in terms of how they're actually constructed and how they're designed to maximize engagement and to actually be successful. But to be successful, first we have to like kind of define what does success actually mean. And so in this case, I'm taking success to mean maximal user engagement and maximal utility, meaning that every feature of the application is actually contributing to the benefit that the users receive in some manner. Nothing is going unused, and no feature is really just there for the sake of being there. It's actually providing a benefit to the user. And then also in terms of engagement, that users are continuously returning to the application, and um, it's not just a one and done thing. In fact, most mobile applications that are created are just downloaded, used once, and never used again. And so those are not successful mobile applications under pretty much any definitions of success. Because of course, a good mobile application is going to get continued usage across time. And that's what's going to have them make money. That's what's going to have them get good downloads. And in general, just have a good monthly active users is also another common metric that people use to measure success for mobile applications. So with that definition out of the way, let's just start at the beginning, namely, what is mobile development? And broadly speaking, you can kind of define it as just developing applications for portable devices. So smartphones, tablets, smartwatches, even anything that's really portable falls under the purview of mobile development. And in general, it falls into this area of computing called edge computing, which is really the counterpart of cloud computing. So whereas cloud computing is on the server, and the compute power is actually far away from the end user who is sitting on their laptop on the other end of it, edge computing is right next to the user. So this is where sensors and IoT and even mobile devices fall, because the compute power, your processor, is on your mobile phone. It's in the user's pocket. It's right there with them. And while the data and other functionalities might reside somewhere in the cloud, the way that the user is interacting with the application is on the edge. And so when you conceptualize mobile applications, I think one distinction that's frequently glossed over, or even like the two are conflated, is it's an often thing that mobile apps are conflated with the product itself. That's kind of not a great way to look at things. Instead, we should look at it as an interface between the user and the product, right? Just it's very similar to how like a brick and mortar retail store is not the actual product of a business, right? That is the way that the customer interacts with the retail products, like shoes or clothes or whatever they're buying from that brick and mortar store. And so mobile apps are really the same thing, or the same concept in the sense of an interface. To kind of make that more concrete, think of DoorDash. The actual product behind DoorDash is food delivery. It's not the DoorDash application, because food delivery in itself could be done through a website or through other mediums. It could be even done over the phone. But the way that DoorDash chooses for us to interact with their food delivery service is through their mobile application primarily. Similarly, Spotify's product is audio streaming, both music and podcasts. The app itself is one way of interaction. Spotify also has a website. That's another mode of interaction. And so keeping that idea of a mobile application as an interface, a way to interact with a product, rather than being the product in and of itself, is a useful distinction from a product management perspective or a product perspective, because now you can think of how do you actually design this interface to make the interaction, or to maximize interaction, to maximize engagement, and to design things in an appropriate and streamlined manner. And the other thing when we think about mobile applications and like what's going to be successful is what's actually happening right now in terms of mobile technology. One of the main trends that's coming up right now, particularly on the iOS side of things, is augmented reality. So this is overlaying visuals on top of the real world. Think Pokemon Go or even Snapchat filters. I think Pokemon Go was one of the first real AR applications that really skyrocketed and went viral. And even though it was viral for like a month or so and then kind of died down, there's still a lot of active users today who are still playing it. Snapchat filters have gotten better and better over time. And so That's another example of just of altering what's on the real world, whether it's altering your face or just placing some, silly 3D models on top of yourself. But that also constitutes augmented reality. And that's something that's very unique to mobile. You can't do that really with a website, at least not in the same integrated way that mobile applications have used it so far. Another big trend is on-device machine learning. So Apple has recently included neural processing units on their phones. And this has actually made it possible to train models that are very specific to the user. And these models, whereas the traditional architecture was to have the machine learning model sit on the server, and that would be a global model that serves every single customer equally with the same trained on the same data. Now it's actually possible to train, just have still a global model, but to fine tune it to the user's specific data and do that entirely on device. So it's privacy preserving, and then also it's a more powerful model because it's now specific to that user. And so if you think of something like Apple's Face ID, this is an example of something that could be done using on-device machine learning. And the other big trend in mobile technology is sensor connectivity. So smartwatches, smart homes, just the general Internet of Things, where we have devices that are all around us sensing data, and mobile applications, or mobile in general, are a great way for the user to actually interact with that data, to see it, to play with it, and to actually learn from it and adjust their lives accordingly. And so some of the more interesting devices that have come out into the space are the Ring doorbell, Amazon Alexa, or the Nest thermostat, where each of these are devices that are controlling parts of your environment and have a lot of data that is being sent to your mobile application. And the mobile app is how the user actually interacts with these devices and controls them. Now, one of the first steps of actually developing a mobile application is deciding what platform you want it to be on. And when you think of a platform, there's really two main ones. There's the iOS and the Android ones, where in general, a lot of times you're actually going to have to pick this platform based off of what your target market's going to be. It's not just a choice that you can make offhand or that you can make at random, because there are differences between the platforms that are not tech related that actually determine what kinds of people you can reach and what kinds of engagement you're going to get from your users. And so here I have three types of segmentations that you can make based off of iOS and Android. The first is price variance. So iOS has a lot of high-end devices. Your iPads and iPhones, they go for hundreds of dollars, $500 upwards. iPhones are like in the thousands of dollar range, right? And they're all sitting in that same space. And so it's a very low variance in terms of price. So you're going to reach a very specific type of socioeconomic user who has those devices. Meanwhile, Android, that has a very high price variance. You have the higher end devices like the Google Pixels, the Samsung Galaxies. Those brand lines are very high, or the high end. And then on the low end, you have the ones that you can really buy you can buy for less than $100 sometimes. And so in terms of users, you're actually going to get a much wider user base, a more diverse user base if you go for Android than if you do for iOS, at least on a socioeconomic basis. And this extends to geography as well. So iOS has a dominant market share in the United States and Europe, whereas Android has a dominant market share in Latin and South America, Asia, and Africa, basically the rest of the world. And this is incredibly important because, for example, if you're trying to create a mobile application that helps people in Africa, you're not going to make it for iOS, because if you did that, practically nobody in any African country has an iOS device. And so your actual application is not going to do very well because you're restricting yourself to a very, very narrow set of people. Whereas if you're a provider for Android, you're going to reach a lot more people, or most likely you're going to reach the people that you're trying to actually have use your application. Another segmentation is the activity level. So it turns out that the behavior of iOS and Android users is actually different. iOS users are much more active with their applications. So if you send them a notification, they're more likely to actually tap that notification and interact with it. They're more likely to spend on in-app purchases. And so if you're trying to make money off of in-app purchases, you're probably going to want to go for an iOS application because you'll simply get more paying customers that way. Android users, on the hand, of course, lower activity level. And not making any assumptions about the reasons of why, if you have an application or a revenue model where you're dependent on high user engagement, you need to consider how is your how are you going to differentiate between the two platforms? Like which platform you're going to choose? And particularly for startups, this is an important question to ask, because when you're a startup, you have limited capital. And if you don't have both an iOS developer and an Android developer on your tech team, and you don't want to use a cross-platform solution like React Native, then you're going to need to choose which one you're going to start with. And in that case, these segmentations become very important. But of course, if your target market doesn't really fall along any of these segmentations, then the platform you choose doesn't really matter. Instead, it will be dictated more by who's on your technology team and which platform they know how to serve. And of course, there are also cross-platform solutions. Like I think Microsoft has released Xamarin, which is a C#-based cross-platform. Google has Flutter. React Native is from Facebook. These solutions are they have one code base that builds for both iOS and Android. And so in that sense, these segmentations at that point don't even matter. Because you can have one code base and both applications. But nevertheless, from a product perspective, you still need to be able to think about how are your iOS and Android users going to act on your application differently. So before I move on to how do we actually design these mobile applications, how do we optimize for the benefits of the mobile estimate interface, I kind of want to stop and take a moment to answer any questions that you guys might have about the things that I've talked about so far. Like, feel free to just unmute or ask in the chat as well. All right, if there's no more questions, then I'll continue on to how do we design these applications. And so one common mistake that people make is that they think everything that should be a mobile application. Everything should not be a mobile application. There are definitive pros and cons to actually making a mobile app. And the key to making mobile apps is to leverage the pros while diminishing the cons. And so here are some of the pros. Here are some of those things that you might want to consider when you're thinking about mobile development. One of the pros, and one of the things that makes it so powerful, is the proximity to users. Mobile apps are on the person's phone. It's right there in their pocket. It's there exactly when they're needed because it's so close to them. They don't have to go to the laptop or to the browser and actually search a URL. They only need to open up their phone and go to the application. It's a simple. And so that proximity makes mobile a very accessible platform. It makes apps on mobile devices very accessible to the users. And that's why they have typically higher engagement than websites. They also have this thing that I call permanence, namely that people have to download it. That means when a user downloads your mobile application, they're making a psychological commitment to use your mobile application. And once they do that, it resides permanently on their device until they decide to delete it because it's taking up too much space. And as we mentioned before, mobile also has the opportunity to interact with a lot of specialized technologies, augmented reality being a great example of this one, where it's not available on other tech. It's only available on mobile. And so if your idea actually incorporates augmented reality or any other specialized technology, then a mobile application is really your only choice. But honestly, the cons sometimes outweigh the pros in this sense for mobile development, because you get a severe reduction in screen size. If you think about how big your iPhone is, the amount of real estate to actually lay things out and to interact with data, if it's data intensive or do complex features, you don't have a lot of real estate on that small screen, comparatively small screen, when I'm comparing it to a laptop, for example. And so you're going to have that constraint actually is quite a large one and can limit the functionality. And now sometimes you can get around it with thinking about how you design your application. That's very true. But in general, you're going to put a lot more thought into designing mobile applications because you have that constraint of screen size. And that's why you really don't see things like Jupyter notebooks or for example, program applications or data hungry data processing applications on mobile phones, because they just don't have, the screen size just kind of limits everything. The next con is like lower processing power. This one is becoming less and less of an issue as phones get more popular, for example, like with the NPUs. But historically, phones don't have a lot of compute, or at least they have a constraint on battery life. And the more processing that you have to do, the more you consume the user's battery. And so in general, if you have something which is taking a lot of compute power, you usually put that compute on a server. And so that's one way to get around it. But if you're in a space with low internet connection, for example, or a low cellular connection, then processing power may actually be a very real constraint. And this is a pro that I listed before, but it also functions as a con, which is permanence. As I mentioned, when you have to download an application, people are making a psychological commitment. And so if they don't want to make that psychological commitment, they're not going to download your application. They're not going to use it. And the last one would be then you have to actually, be subject to Apple and Google's rules. And Apple and Google Apple in particular is notorious for being very, very wishy-washy on what their actual rules are. And in fact, Epic Games right now is going through a huge lawsuit. Spotify is also going through a huge lawsuit with Apple. And this is, if your model of revenue is paid subscriptions or through an in-app store, you actually have to give Apple and Google a commission on that money. And so by being on mobile, you have to be subject to their rules and to pay them the commissions. Otherwise, whereas if you're on the web, you could just use Stripe's API and you wouldn't have to bother with a 30% commission that these companies are taking. So with those pros and cons, let's now think about what are the design actually going to be. So you're trying to maximize those pros and leverage and minimize the cons. And so in general, what that looks like is just keeping people engaged in general. And so one frequent thing that good mobile applications usually leverage is immediate and frequent information. So news applications are a good example of this, where they hit me with New York Times hits me with a breaking news notification probably once every day, right? They're always providing some new article or some new thing for me to read. And every news application does this. And that's one of the reasons why it's powerful on mobile, because while I'm waiting in line or just randomly, if I'm feeling bored, I can flip open the news application and read an article because there's something new for me to read. Mobile applications also provide ongoing functionality. They're not a one and done thing. And Venmo is a good example of this. There's a lot of times, over the course of a week where you need to Venmo somebody, particularly if you're hanging out with friends or if you just need to share payments between people. And so Venmo, while you might not use it every day, or you're still going to use it over the course of months, at least once. The other thing is simple and easy to use and accessible features. And actually a really bad example of this, a successful app that did very poorly in this category was the earliest iterations of Snapchat. The earliest iterations of Snapchat were purely swipe-based navigation. And so because of that, people couldn't understand the application. They didn't know how to navigate because Snapchat was the first app of its kind to actually use swipe-based navigation. And so because of that, they lost out a huge part of their market because people just couldn't understand it. Now that once they've realized this mistake, now they've actually gone back and added touch-based navigation to move between the stories page and the camera page and the feed page. And so that's an example of how you can still break some of these rules and still be successful. But in the end, when you're going to be more successful, you need to still make your features accessible and still follow some of them to some extent. Compelling design is another one which mobile applications typically use. Because if your app is ugly, people aren't going to use it. They're typically going to get frustrated with it, or they're just not going to be as compelled to use it again. So Spotify, I think, is a good example of this, where not only is it aesthetically pleasing, but it's also made in a way where there's a lot of functionality that you can access in just a couple of taps. And it's one of the most streamlined applications, in my opinion, for actually doing what you need to do in a very efficient manner. And so it's very well designed, and that keeps people on the application. Now, one recent thing that's I guess it's not so much recent, but it also is one that's very sometimes overused, is gamification. Namely, that idea that you can take user actions and keep them engaged by gamifying them, typically through leaderboards or awards and achievements or some other game-like structure. Now, this one I think is frequently misused and even abused, and it's treated somewhat as a panacea. But in order to make gamification structures actually successful, you need to really pay attention to what your incentives are and how you're actually structuring the game aspect of your application. So to kind of highlight this, I'd like to go over 3 successful examples of good gamification ideas. And the first one, and I think the one that really everybody knows and can think of, is Snapchat streaks. Now, the Snapchat streaks were so successful that people just use Snapchat for the sole purpose of keeping their streak, for the sole purpose of getting a higher number, because every single day that they use the application, their streak would increment by 1 with a certain person. And so that's an example where Snapchat drew people in psychologically. Their usage of the app was tied to that number, making that number get higher and higher and higher. And when people lost that number, then they felt bad about it. And so this was a great pro in terms of increasing Snapchat's engagement, because even when people lost streaks, they wanted to get right back into them, to get right back where they started, and to even beat their previous record. And so this was the type of game where the user is really playing with themselves, where they're trying to just get a high score, and they can even compete with their friends by saying like, hey, look, I have a Snapchat score of 545. Like, what's your highest streak? And so that's one way which Snapchat really capitalized and really gained a lot of market share, because they had this gamified structure. A maybe more productive example would be Forest, which is a productivity application. So here, Forest is creating a psychological attachment to an animated tree that exists on their phone. And the more that the user focuses on their work and not on social media or any other distraction, the more this tree grows. And now Forest has even increased the psychological tie to them by actually making it a benefit for conservation, where they actually plant real trees and they have that real tree tied to users. And so users feel good about the way that feel good about their usage of the application, and they feel good about being productive, because it's actually making a positive benefit to the world. It's unlike the streaks, which was purely technological. Forest has a real life component to it, and it makes people happy. And so that keeps them tied to the application. And so that's an example of a good gamified structure. Now, a more subtle example would be TikTok. So the idea of TikTok is small, short videos, and you can consume a lot of them in a short amount of time. And because you can consume a lot of them in a short amount of time, there's really this underlying subtle idea that anybody can go viral, because a lot of users are going through a lot of content in very little time. And so you constantly need to be showing people something. So that way your video can be seen by a lot of people, and then you can go viral. And so again, in this case, you're encouraged to post by essentially you're trying to win the lottery. You're trying to go viral on TikTok. And it's made possible by the fact that you can consume things very quickly. So that's a more subtle gamification structure, where you're still creating a psychological attachment between the user and the application. And that's, I think, the undercurrent of all gamification, is really making the user tie to your app by either making them feel very positively about what they're doing, or somehow tying not using the application with a negative feeling. Case in point being Snapchat, where if you break that streak, that's the negative feeling of like, oh no, I have to start it back up again. And the reason I think gamification is overused is because once a gamified structure is there, other apps which try to copy it often don't do as well. And so things like leaderboards and achievements, those are almost widespread. And so they no longer provide that same level of commitment that users simply don't have that same level of commitment, because they're so used to them by now. And so it takes a lot more work to actually make those old gamified structures continue to work for the current users. And so that's why I say gamification is not a panacea, because you really need to think about it thoroughly in order to do it well. Before we go into the next section, this is another good stopping point to see if anybody has any questions or any comments or thoughts about anything I've talked about so far. Okay, if not, then I will continue. So what is a panacea? A panacea is something that you believe solves everything, essentially. So I'm trying to think of a good example. I can't think of a good example off the top of my head, but I'll keep thinking about it and get back to you on that. But now let's think about, like, okay, when do we use mobile? And this is essentially going to be a bunch of case studies that really elucidate a lot of the, pros and cons, pros that I talked about earlier, as well as some of the things that keep people engaged. So the first step, and the real answer to this question of when should you make a mobile application versus making it to a website, is when the form fits the function. You don't want to be like this guy on the right over here, where you're trying to stuff a square peg into a round peg into a square hole. You can't make a website and turn it into a mobile application and expect it to be successful just with no changes made. You need to actually take a lot of thought and put a lot of consideration in how you're going to change it and adapt it to the mobile form in order to maximize that engagement that we've been talking about. So the first app that I think does this really well is Robinhood. And Robinhood does well in the accessibility portion of this, where they've really taken a complex thing of investing in options trading, stock trading, just like looking at prices, joining earning calls, really everything about investing. They've pretty much condensed that down into just a few taps. If anybody's used Robinhood, then you know to buy a stock, all you need to do is go to the stock page, tap that you want to buy it, put how many shares you want to buy or sell, and then swipe to confirm. And so in terms of actually fulfilling their mission of democratizing finance, Robinhood has done very well by being a mobile application because they're right there in the user's pocket. So it's very close to the user. The user likes proximity, and they're also making it accessible because what was once before like very complicated with having to care about fees and processing times and all these other things that online brokerage firms really put in the user's face, Robinhood strips all that away and just makes a couple taps. So this is why they've really grown amongst the young and unexperienced investors market, because it's incredibly easy for them to do so. It's accessible. So here they've really taken a pro of mobile and taken it all the way. And that's what's made them successful so far. Social media is a very clear example of what's been a successful mobile application. And they've done well in the category of immediate and frequent information. They're always there when you need it, and they're always providing something new. So Twitter, which is here on the right, every time you go onto Twitter, there's some new tweet. Even if you've exhausted all the tweets on your timeline and you refresh, there's still new things because they can provide you things that your friends have liked or that your friends have retweeted, or just things that they think might be relevant to you. You're never bored on Twitter because there's always something new to be read. And the same goes for Facebook. There's a reason why Facebook's mobile application generates 90% of the traffic to Facebook. Right? There are 2 billion people on Facebook, 2/7 of the entire world. And their mobile application accounts for 90% of that traffic. It's because immediate and frequent information is so much more powerful on mobile than it is on a website. Because again, it's proximity, it's the frequency of things, and it keeps people engaged, being able to see something new every time they use the application. There's also this phenomenon of people just opening up their phone, flipping through all their socials really fast without really looking at things or like understanding them, and then going back to whatever they're doing. That phenomenon is another example of just how powerful mobile applications can be, where people can do this almost automatically. It becomes instinct to them to use your application. So that's one of the extreme ways that you can define success in terms of engagement. Success for mobile apps. Then another good example is Uber. So Uber, it does well as mobile because it makes life easy for you. Whenever you need to hail a ride, you don't have to pull out your phone or like go to the browser and type in uber.com and then log in and then provide all your information and get a ride that way. Instead, you just open up the app, you're already logged in, and you can get your ride and go. It's made life easier for you by being in your pocket, by being close to you, by being downloaded. And it's taken a very common task like ride hailing and made it fast. And so this has contributed to Uber's success in terms of downloads. In terms of profitability, well, that's a different business issue, but it's not a function of their mobile application being wrong. So thanks guys, thanks for listening. If you want to learn more, there is a article version of this, which is at bit.ly/mobile app success. And yeah, if you guys have any questions, then I'd love to answer them.
Well, what's the link to the article again?
It's here on the slide. It's bit.ly/mobile-app-success. Yeah, I can put it in the chat too, I guess. And I guess to answer Shlomo's question earlier of what is a panacea, I think of Facebook, Facebook is trying to be the panacea of like all social because they've basically acquired like Instagram, WhatsApp, and every new social medium that comes up, they try and copy it. And so they're trying to be the user, the world's one-stop shop for social media consumption, or like any of the super apps that are like WeChat is like a panacea for also like chat, shopping, pretty much everything that they've consumed. So it's like a one-stop shop almost, or something that you can go to for like that solves all of your problems. All right, seems like there are no other questions. So thanks all for listening, and hope you have a good night.